Hi everybody, welcome to our online lecture for Chapter 13, which is Ethical Leadership. Close the door there for everybody. This is an important chapter, and I have to stress this. This is a chapter that we do in this course that really, realistically, we do it and it's tied into accreditation more than anything else. We're entering a profession, and you all know this, where you have to act more ethically than you do in any other profession. I would make an argument, maybe medicine would be one of the only professions where you have higher ethical expectations than you do in education, but you're being watched at all times in this profession, and you have to keep that in mind. And I want you to think about that when you're working on your assignments, for this class. The principalship really has three areas where people break ethics. You'll find these are presented on the news all the time. It's not an Oklahoma thing. It's a national thing as well. When it comes to standardized tests, that tends to be one of the areas, but when you have your finance course, and if you have me for it, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about kind of the ethical breaches and violations when it comes to standardized tests. You have to ensure that not only are you acting ethically, but that your staff is too. You're going to find probably, my experience has shown me finance is number one, standardized test breaches is number two, and bullying is number three. Obviously, the news media is going to report the bullying more, but you're going to see a lot of financial breaches and problems with standardized testing where there are ethics issues in the principalship. The problem that I see, and I think you need to know this, you can take the fall for what your staff has done wrong if they do or do not blame it on you, and there will be an investigation, your name will be in the media, and you have to know that and you have to be aware of that. So the most current breach of standardized testing, this is the one that's kind of been all over the news, happened in a place called Union, New Jersey. And it was national news this past summer, and it's still being talked about and it's still being looked at. It was related to too much improvement on test scores. There were teachers that were in a neighboring district who had cheated on the standardized test and they had changed answers, but the New Jersey case was of big interest because the improvement was so big that they obviously knew that something was wrong, and they just needed to find a way to investigate and find out what the cause and what the effect of it was. But that's certainly worth you looking at. The other, in my previous job, we had a partnership with Clark County School District in Las Vegas. Basically what that meant is that if students wanted to student teach in Vegas, they got to student teach in Vegas. I wish we had that partnership here. It doesn't happen, but it would be nice. I would love to go out and supervise in Vegas. But they gave 2 years on test scores. And it was linked to invalid testing over 2 years because of irregularities in scores and in basically how the scores were reported and in the progressions of students from 8th to 11th grade. And they charted it over a 2-year period looking at those progressions from 8th to 11th grade, and there was a 78% improvement. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that a 78% testing improvement is obviously going to cause people to have questions and concerns, but that was the big issue in Clark County. So I mentioned this, but I think it's important. Obviously you can show improvement in your schools, and we hope that you do show improvement in your schools, but you could show too much improvement in your schools, and your school might be investigated by another governing body. You are the ones in your building that really are responsible for training your teachers in how to test and how to implement tests. And if they have a breach, that could fall back on you as the administrator. So I beg of all of you, please be careful. Don't let that happen, and do your best to ensure that those breaches don't occur. So we're going to look at law and ethics. And one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is ethics is built into this course, law isn't. So when you think about law in education, I really want you to wait until you have 5723, which is our law course. Ethics are really the principles and values that people have, but law really is what governs and maintains that. The same response could happen. Something could be both a legal issue and a legal concern and an ethical concern as well, but ethical standards might be different than what the legal standard says. And that's an important takeaway. And for this class, I don't want you to think about law. I really want you to think about ethics. So I think the graph says it all, and it's a simple and easy graph, but let's be real. Law and ethics do overlap and intersect at some places. What I think is important is the difference between what ethics are and what morals are. Morals are the values that govern a society and basically say what's right is right and wrong. They keep turning the light off so you guys can get a better view. It's one of the challenges with recording in this room with the glare, so I apologize. But ethics really is what are the means and what those values represent and should be. Moral and ethics, that's really what I want you to focus on in this class when you're writing your final paper and your leader paper as well. Ethical fundamentalism, really this is looking for an outside source. It's somebody that can guide you in your practice ethically. This doesn't have to be a person, it can be a book, it can be religious scripture, but it doesn't, it's basically looking at that person and using them as your model and using them as your muse to determine how you're going to approach things ethically or unethically, however you choose to approach it. Your ethical threshold is important to me. This is your individualized limitations on what you think is right and what you think is wrong. And everybody has a different ethical threshold. Courts of law are responsible for determining kind of what the standard should be for that and how much of an impact that can have on somebody. But it's important that you know that ethical threshold is basically your own personal perception on your ethical limitations. The notion of the greatest good is that you make a decision and you base it on how it impacts the most people that are impacted by the action. This is different than the next principle, which we'll go over, which is utilitarianism, and I'll cover that in a few slides. If we want to live in a utopian society, which clearly we all want to live in a utopian society, we have to rely on opinions and feelings. We have to gauge the greatest good for the greatest number of people, help the most people that you can, and follow the golden rule. And that's super important. Do unto others as you would have done to you, and that doesn't have to be tied to religion. It's just a principle that you follow. Society doesn't operate like this, and this is really why we have a legal system that's in place to kind of manage this. So ethics is used to tell us what should be done, and law is used to force people to do what they're supposed to do. That's the real difference between the two of them, and I want you to be aware of that. So this is important, because this is a little different than the greatest good. Utilitarianism is picking an action that follows what's best for society. The greatest good is picking an action that follows what's best for the greatest number of people. The utilitarianistic principles are difficult to apply. They treat morality as something that's impersonal. It's difficult to estimate the good that can result from actions, and if I think one person is more important than a group of 20, then I can make a different decision. So when you're thinking about utilitarianism, I don't want you to think it's the greatest number of people, it's who's impacted the most and what that impact looks like. So Kantian ethics, really it's basically saying that we follow what I call in human resources courses the hot stove rule. We treat all cases alike, and that we have to be able to abide by the rule that we set forth in our own ideas and decisions. But as I state, and I think this is a big idea, it's difficult to reach a consensus as to what universal rules should be, what they should look like, and that's kind of why we have a legal system that's in place. So in the principleship, all cases aren't treated alike. Past behavior leads to greater punishments, and principles have problems if the media gets involved. If something's swept under the rug, the principal doesn't get in as much trouble. And that's just the honest-to-God truth of it. And whether you agree with that or disagree with it, it's true. And the other point that I make, too, lower socioeconomic school districts suffer from the most media scrutiny. They're the ones that are on site, and they're the ones where they have people looking at them constantly. So you need to know that, and you need to be aware of that if you're entering an environment that where that could potentially be an option, and that could be a problem as well. So if you move into a more challenging district, you got to keep that in mind. So Good Samaritan laws. If you do something that benefits somebody and they cause harm from it, should you be punished for it? And the example that I normally use if I was teaching this in a face-to-face class is this notion of you know, if you're a teacher and you have CPR license and you don't administer CPR properly, can you be punished and should you be punished? What should you do in those situations? What are you supposed to do? I only put this up here because I want you to think about it and I want you to consider it. So the act that really caused us, as crazy as this sounds, the act that caused us to have an ethics component in our principal training was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. All businesses had to follow standards. All grad schools, all grad schools had to enact classes that had an ethical belief and an ethical practice as well. And we'll talk about this in school finance also, but it's kind of this open accounting standards that are really stressed in those courses, and there are very serious implications to schools that I want you to know and I want you to be aware of. So, code of ethics. Code of ethics are good because organizations are allowed to set them and they're able to enforce them, but from a marketing perspective, it's good for the media as well. But if something goes against the code of ethics, there can be intense scrutiny that's involved in it, and bad things could not occur because of the problems and the breach with the code of ethics. When you talk about this, you obviously have to talk about Enron or crooked E or melting E, whichever metaphor you want to use to describe Enron. But Enron was interesting. I'm not going to go over this too in depth. Me and my business background, you really need to watch a movie called The Smartest Guys in the Room. It's an Enron. It's about Enron, and it's fascinating. But basically, what happened, the companies, the main people in the company knew the company was losing money, but they created subsidiary companies to try to save and protect their own money, and it gave this very questionable public image, and most people, were free without many major problems from it happening. It led to things like politician ethical disclosure. Some of the ethical issues that have been present for politicians in the past. Politicians are privileged speakers. They have the right to kind of say what they want and to say statements on the floor into Congress that they can, and they can get away with most of the things that they say because they're considered privileged in what they do. And it's why politicians get away with saying most of the things that they say. So, keep that in mind when you're watching any presidential debates or anything of that nature. So, this is an important idea. If you're a figure in the public eye, you cannot file a defamation lawsuit unless you can prove that what was said or published about you undoubtedly destroyed your reputation. When you place yourself in the public eye, you have to deal with the consequences in tabloids that are printed about you. And that's the same for principals. You're considered a public figure as a school building principal. And you might not know that and you might not be aware of that, but you got to keep that in mind. If you're in charge of an F school, if John Smith is in charge of an F school, it becomes John Smith, principal of F school, blah, blah, blah. That's how they can title you. You don't have privacy and you don't have protection. And I don't want you to go into this profession thinking that if you're doing school reform that you have protection, because you don't. If somebody wants to challenge you and call you a principal at an F school, they have the right to do that. So the legal compliance, if I'm tying this into law, and I will just a little bit, there's this notion of the moral minimum. This is the minimum standard for ethical business behavior, basically saying what might be obvious to one person might not be obvious to another. And it's a shade of gray area that I've already talked about earlier in this PowerPoint, because what I think is a moral minimum might be completely different than what you think is a moral minimum. And truthfully, what everybody thinks is a moral minimum might be completely different. So organizations exist to maximize profits. If they are a for-profit organization, that is why they exist. They exist to increase profits. That's what they're supposed to do. Nonprofit organizations need to be transparent on money coming in and out of the system, and the stakeholders really are the ones that have say on where the money goes, who gets it, how it's enforced, kind of, that sort of thing. So virtue-based ethics, this is a big idea on your personal leadership paper. I really want you to engage the virtues that your leader that you selected, what they engage in. So what do they do? How do they help others? What makes their values mean something? What makes them have some sort of standing? So try to think about the virtues in leaders' characters as well. So Heffet's really looked at this notion of how leaders really deal with challenging values and ethical conflicts from work, which we all know that happens all of the time. And organizationally, we'll talk about this a little bit in our organizational theory class, and we'll go over kind of how this impacts work. So what will happen, what do leaders do when they're in authority positions? Well, the first thing they do is they try to get people focused on the issues that are a problem. I think that goes without saying. They act as a reality test regarding what information is and what it looks like. They manage and frame issues. They orchestrate conflicting perspectives. And they also facilitate the decision-making process as well. The idea of conflicting perspectives doesn't have to be a bad thing. In a lot of cases, if you're working and you're dealing in a transparent organization, I don't see anything wrong with there being conflicting perspectives as long as it's presented in a clear and balanced way for everybody that's involved in the proceedings. So my belief, if you look at kind of this work, and like I said, you're developing educational organizations, or your org theory class will really go in depth on this, but individuals that feel compensated fairly in their organizations, they're the ones that are more likely to act ethically under their leader's direction. If the leader's ethical, the subordinates are ethical as well. My issue with this that I always say, and you've kind of heard my theory on this, is that most people in education feel underappreciated and undercompensated. So most of them aren't going to feel fairly compensated anyway. So I want to give you a few slides from the Nordhaus text in relation to the principalship. Honestly, these are more for your own perusal, and you can determine if you think this can help you with the final paper. This notion, too, of treating others as ends rather than as means is kind of the reverse of Machiavellianism. So I would call this reverse Machiavellianism. It's this notion that a good leader listens to people, understands when people disagree, they empathize with others, they treat people with respect, and they give them a sense of worth, and they give them value for individual differences as well. Leaders are also exist to serve others. How can they empower? How can they help build teams? How can they nurture people, help them grow, and help them grow the organization, but grow as people as well? How can they pursue their own individualized interests as well? And that's a follower-centered approach. This other notion of fairness and ethical justice, this is an important one in our education system today. Can you treat all subordinates in an equal manner? What does that look like? Do you do differential treatment? If you do, can you justify it? And I think that's a big takeaway message, because if you're going to do it, it has to be justifiable. So being honest is also important. I think poor leaders are ones that make promises that they can't keep. And poor leaders are also ones that avoid dealing with obligations and things that they've connected to and they've convinced to. And if they're unable to balance and monitor appropriate things, that can be a problem as well. Good ethical leaders will build community and care about the common good. They'll care about every single person that's in a group and what those people need. And they'll reach out beyond their own goals to the wider community. And they'll try to be attentive to the interest of the community and culture more than anything else. So I keep saying this, but I think it needs stress. You're entering a position where you're under constant scrutiny, and you need to know that. You're going to deal with a lot of challenges, and it's going to define you in your career. And the teacher that doesn't act ethically, if they make the newspaper, nobody forgets them, and it's difficult to overcome. And with search engines today, you're never going to be able to overcome it completely. So the next chapters, we're going to go over a little bit more on leadership, but most of the stuff now should have been foundational enough to you. We're going to look at things like gender, culture, team leadership, and I hope that most of this stuff can help you on your code of ethics. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know. Thank you.